3 years ago, I tore something in my left knee on a backpacking trip, mile 19 of a mountain pass, and the doctor who looked at the scan said something that stuck with me. She said the wear pattern looked like it belonged to someone who walked for a living, not someone who sat at a desk 5 days a week and hiked on weekends. I laughed it off. Then, out of pure boredom during the recovery, I sent off one of those consumer DNA kits, and a few weeks later, a number came back that I was not expecting. 2% of my genome, the report said, traces to Neanderthals. I am no geneticist, and I will say that up front, but that number would not leave me alone. Because if 2% of me is Neanderthal, then some of whatever made my knee ache that day on the mountain might be inherited from a creature who did this same thing, walking on frozen ground for 400,000 years. So I went looking for how they actually moved, not the myth of the caveman shuffling around one valley his whole life. The real story of how a heavy-bodied, barrel-chested species crossed an entire Ice Age continent on foot, and what that walking cost their bodies. What I found rewired how I think about my own legs. Here is the frame first, because it matters. Neanderthals are not some vague, ancient people you picture in a fur loincloth standing next to a fire. They are a specific, datable population that existed from roughly 400,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago, concentrated across Europe and Western Asia, hugging the edge of an ice sheet that at its worst reached down into what is now Germany and Poland. Not Africa, not the Sahara. A cold belt, glacier to steppe to river valley, and they walked across almost all of it without wheels, without domesticated animals, without maps. That is the whole question of this video. How does a body do that, generation after generation, in a world that is trying to freeze it to death? So picture the very edge of that range, somewhere in what's now Uzbekistan. A limestone cave called Teshik Tash, roughly 70,000 years ago. A small band moves along a canyon rim, following a herd of ibex down toward water before the light goes. An older woman at the back of the line stops, points at a shift in the cliff shadow, and grunts out something short and sharp. Researchers who study the shape of the Neanderthal hyoid bone, the little floating bone in the throat that anchors speech, now think that sound was probably a real word, not just a bark of alarm. No recording of a Neanderthal voice will ever exist, but the anatomy says these were not silent shapes moving through the landscape. They were talking to each other the whole way. They are not migrating in the sense we use the word for birds, packing up, flying a continent, settling somewhere new. They are doing something slower and stranger. Chemical signatures in their teeth, strontium isotopes that lock in the local rock and water a person drank as a child, tell researchers that many individuals barely traveled at all across a lifetime. Sites in France, like the caves at Combe-Grenal and Lazaret, show people who lived and died within a range you could walk in a single day, maybe 20 or 30 kilometers from where they started. That's it. That's your entire universe, edge to edge, for an entire life. Think about that against your own week. 20 kilometers is a short commute. It's driving to the next town over for groceries. And that was the whole world for some of these individuals, not through choice, but through how the landscape and the group's survival math worked. Small bands, maybe 15 to 25 people, could not risk wandering into unknown territory with no guarantee of shelter or water. So most of a Neanderthal's actual footsteps looped inside a small, memorized patch of ground. And yet, stop, because here's the part that doesn't square with that first fact, and it's the part that took me down the rabbit hole. If everybody stayed local, Neanderthals should never have made it out of one river valley. But the fossil and stone tool record puts them from Portugal in the west to the Altai Mountains of Siberia in the east, a straight-line distance of something like 7,000 kilometers, further than New York to Rome and back. So the population as a whole crossed a continent, while the individual, most of the time, barely crossed a county line. The only way to hold both of those facts together is generational relay. Nobody made that walk. Nobody decided at 40,000 years ago to hike from the Atlantic coast to Siberia. Instead, over hundreds of generations, a young pair split off from a home range, pushed 30 kilometers further along a river than their parents ever had, and settled. Their children pushed another stretch. Multiply that by 10,000 years, 20,000 years, and the species crawls across an entire landmass without a single individual ever seeing more than a sliver of it. It's less like a journey and more like a message passed hand to hand down a very long line of runners, each one only ever running their own short leg, none of them aware of where the message started or where it would end up. Here's where the movement stopped being gentle. Ice ages are not a steady cold snap, they are violent oscillations, and Neanderthals lived through several full glacial cycles, meaning the map they walked kept redrawing itself under their feet within a single lifetime. A river valley that fed a family for 20 years could turn to permafrost tundra within a generation, and the herds that valley depended on, reindeer, horse, the occasional mammoth on the open steppe, would shift their own routes to follow the grass line south or into unglaciated pockets. So movement for a Neanderthal band was not sightseeing. It was logistics under a countdown clock. Follow the animals or starve. Follow them into terrain nobody in the group has ever set foot on. Bioarchaeologist Eric Trinkaus, working with Thomas Berger, noticed something strange when they looked at a stack of Neanderthal skeletons. The pattern of healed fractures, especially in the skull and upper body, matched modern rodeo bull riders and hockey enforcers more than any other population researchers had cross-referenced. Not soldiers, not marathon runners, rodeo riders. Which tells you these were not people death-marching mildly across open plains. They were getting close enough to wound large, panicking animals with a wooden spear to finish the job, again and again, over an entire working lifetime. And the mobility that mattered most wasn't distance. It was the ability to close 6 feet of ground on something that outweighed them by half a ton, and not die doing it. Archaeologists have reconstructed the moment right before the charge down to the footing. A hunter braced against a river-cut bank, spear angled low, calling out one clipped signal to a partner circling the herd from the other side. Go, now. And then closing that gap at a dead sprint before the animal can turn. That single 6-foot sprint is the actual unit of Neanderthal movement that mattered most, repeated thousands of times across a life. Far more than any long walk between valleys ever was. There's a second kind of evidence for how far these bands actually ranged, and it has nothing to do with bones or teeth. It's the stone itself. Flint and chert don't occur everywhere. They sit in specific outcrops, and archaeologists can trace a finished tool back to the exact quarry the raw material came from. At several sites, that source sits 80, even 100 kilometers from where the tool was found, dropped and discarded. That's the distance from Los Angeles to San Diego, carried on foot, on top of a home range that isotopes say was usually only 20 or 30 kilometers wide. Which means the stone traveled further than the person who used it ever personally walked in a season. Passed along through trade and visiting, bands crossing paths at a shared river bend and swapping goods. Movement didn't always require a person to move. Sometimes it just took a favor between neighbors who'd otherwise stay strangers. Stop and think about that for a second, because it reframes the whole dumb, lumbering brute image that most of us grew up with, the sloped forehead punchline from every cartoon and museum diorama. A body that can sprint into ambush range on an aurochs, absorb a goring, heal, and go back out again the next season is not a stupid design. It's an incredibly specific, incredibly costly athletic specialization, one that cost these people their joints by their 30s, the way it costs modern rugby players theirs. The myth didn't come from the bones. It came from one badly reconstructed 19th century skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints, an elderly man riddled with arthritis who a French scientist named Marcelin Boule drew as hunched and ape-like in 1911. And that single flawed drawing became the template for over a century of pop culture. One man's mistake became an entire species' reputation. The science has been walking that back for decades now, and it's still not caught up in most people's heads. Now, how they physically covered ground when the herds moved is where I have to be honest with you and lay out the different tables, because researchers genuinely don't agree on all of it. The official picture, the one you'll find in most textbooks, is entirely pedestrian. 2 legs, no boats, no domesticated pack animals, everything carried on the back or dragged. Movement following river corridors and mountain passes like the Zagros Range into what's now Iraq and Iran, because water and low ground make natural highways, and freezing mountain crossings do not. That version is well supported, and it's most of the truth. But then there's a stranger thread. Stone tools with a distinctly Neanderthal signature, Mousterian-style flaking, have turned up on some Mediterranean islands, Crete among them, in contexts that some archaeologists date to well before Neanderthals should have had any way to get there, since there's no evidence of watercraft in their toolkit. If those dates and that attribution hold up, it would mean either accidental rafting on storm debris or something researchers are much more cautious about saying out loud: intentional short-hop crossings by people who understood water was there and chose to deal with it. It's a minority position, and honestly, a shaky one. The dating and the species attribution are both disputed, and I don't think most specialists in the field would put real money on deliberate seafaring. But I understand why the idea is seductive. It would mean these were not passive wanderers pushed by hunger, but curious animals who occasionally looked at a horizon and wanted to know what was past it. I don't think the evidence gets us there yet. I think the honest answer sits with the boring version: river, pass, herd, repeat. But I'll admit, the island question keeps a small door open that nobody's shut for good. And there's a third, uglier version of how they moved, worth naming honestly: not moving forward at all, but being pushed. Genetic and fossil dating both put the disappearance of distinct Neanderthal populations at somewhere around 40,000 years ago, right as anatomically modern humans were expanding into the same territory from the east. Whether that overlap meant violent displacement, competition for the same herds and caves, slow absorption through interbreeding, or some mix of all three, is genuinely unresolved and actively argued in the literature. Anyone who tells you with total confidence that one group wiped the other out in some kind of coordinated extermination is overstating what the evidence actually shows. What isn't disputed is the genetic outcome. Geneticist Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute sequenced a workable Neanderthal genome and published it in Science back in 2010, and population geneticist David Reich's later work confirmed the same finding from a different angle. Nearly everyone whose ancestry traces outside Africa carries somewhere around 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. Not because Neanderthals vanished cleanly, because somewhere along those same river corridors and mountain passes, 2 different kinds of human ran into each other and had children, which loops back to me, honestly. Some of what geneticists have actually traced in that leftover 2% isn't cosmetic, Zeeberg and Pabo's later research linked specific Neanderthal-derived gene variants to how some people process pain, and to skin and hair traits still showing up in living populations today. And other studies have tied inherited variants to immune response. None of that is about race, and I want to be direct about that, because this kind of finding gets twisted online constantly. This DNA shows up across every population with ancestry outside Africa. It's not a marker of one group being more or less anything than another. It's just leftover paperwork from a couple of very cold, very long journeys 40,000 years ago that happened to end in one particular reunion. I'm not saying my sore knee is a smoking gun. That's not how any of this works. And I'd be lying to you if I dressed it up as diagnosis instead of curiosity. But it is strange to sit with the fact that the 2% of me that came from somewhere else might carry, folded up in a string of chemistry too small to see, a faint echo of a species that walked an entire Ice Age world one 20-kilometer loop at a time. So did they conquer a continent, or did a continent slowly happen to them, one relay leg at a time, while every single person doing the walking thought they were just following the deer? I don't have a clean answer, and neither does anyone who's actually spent a career on this. What I keep coming back to is the shape of it, a species that almost never chose to go far, and still somehow ended up everywhere between the Atlantic coast and Siberia, carried there by nothing more dramatic than hunger, a river, and enough generations for a short walk to add up into something that looks, from 40,000 years out, almost like intention. Next time your legs ache after a long day on your feet, that ache has a lineage. Whether 2% of it is owed to a hunter who once closed the gap on a wounded aurochs somewhere in an Ice Age valley, I genuinely don't know. But I like that I can't rule it out.